The rain was not heavy, but it was the kind of cold, persistent drizzle that soaks through everything and chills you to the bone. On a busy Tuesday afternoon in the heart of the city, the streets were packed with people rushing to get somewhere warm. Everyone had a destination. Everyone had a purpose. Everyone, that is, except for one small, lonely figure moving slowly through the shadows of the buildings. He was a dog, but it was hard to tell what breed he might have been at one point. Life on the streets had erased his history. His fur, once perhaps a golden brown or sandy color, was now matted with thick clumps of dirt and grime. It hung off his frame in uneven patches, doing little to protect his shivering body from the biting wind. He was incredibly thin. His ribs poked out sharply against his skin, a roadmap of hunger that anyone could see if they just bothered to look down. But nobody did dot to the crowds of people rushing past. He was invisible. He was just another obstacle, a nuisance to be avoided on the sidewalk. He walked with a heavy limp, favoring his left front paw, which had been stepped on a few days earlier. Every step was a reminder of the pain, but he had to keep moving. If he stopped moving, the cold would win. The city was loud. Car horns blared, sirens wailed in the distance, and hundreds of voices chattered away on phones or laughed with friends. But for this little dog, the world was a very quiet place. He wasn't part of the noise. He was a ghost floating through it, his head hung low, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just looking for a reason to keep going. His stomach gave a violent lurch, a painful cramp that doubled him over for a second. It had been 2 days since he had found anything edible, a discarded crust of bread behind a dumpster that had been mostly mold. He needed food. The gnawing emptiness inside him was becoming harder to ignore than the cold. He lifted his nose to the damp air, sniffing desperately, searching for a scent that meant hope. Suddenly the wind shifted. The smell hit him like a miracle. It was the rich, greasy scent of meat and onions. Hot food? His ears perked up slightly, and he felt a small surge of adrenaline. He limped faster, following the delicious aroma toward a busy street corner. There, parked under a large red umbrella, was a food cart. The vendor, a burly man in a white apron, was flipping sausages and steaming peppers. The smell was intoxicating. The dog's mouth watered, and he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't want much. He didn't expect a full meal. He just wanted a scrap, a small piece of sausage that might have fallen on the counter or the pavement. He approached slowly, keeping his body low to the ground, trying to make himself look as small and harmless as possible. He weaved through a forest of legs, dodging boots and sneakers, careful not to touch anyone and get kicked. He got within a few feet of the cart, the warmth of the grill radiating toward him. It felt so good. He looked up at the vendor with big, sad eyes, letting out a soft, barely audible whimper. It was a beg. It was a plea for help. The vendor was busy serving a customer. He handed over a foil-wrapped hot dog and turned to grab some napkins. That's when you saw the dog. The man's face didn't soften with pity. It didn't light up with compassion. Instead, it twisted into a scowl of annoyance. "Hey, get out of here." The vendor shouted, his voice booming above the noise of the street. The dog cowered instinctively, flattening himself even further against the wet pavement. He didn't run. He was too weak to run fast, and a small part of him still held on to hope that the man might change his mind. Maybe he would toss a piece of food just to make him leave, but the vendor didn't reach for food. He reached for a rag. He waved it aggressively at the dog, taking a step forward. "Go on, shoo! You're dirty, and you're scaring away the customers. Get lost." The fear spiked in the dog's chest. He knew that tone. He knew what usually came next, hands pushing him, feet kicking him, or worse. He let out a yelp and scrambled backward, his claws slipping on the slick concrete. He didn't look back. He just ran as fast as his 3 good legs would carry him, dodging blindly through the crowd of people who just sighed and stepped aside as he scrambled past. The pain in his leg flared up, hot and sharp, but he ignored it. He ran until his lungs burned and the smell of the food was gone, replaced again by the smell of exhaust fumes and wet trash. He found himself on a quieter side street, alone again. The failure hurt more than the hunger. It crushed his spirit. He had tried, and he had been rejected. He needed a place to hide. He needed to get out of the rain. His eyes scanned the street, blurry from exhaustion. Ahead of him, a black car was parked against the curb. It was low to the ground, and the gap between the undercarriage and the pavement looked like a cave. It looked like safety. The dog limped over to the car. He checked to make sure nobody was watching, then slowly lowered his body and crawled underneath. It was tight, and the smell of oil and rubber was strong, but it was dry. The water dripping from the passing cars splattered the edges, but he was sheltered in the middle. He curled up into a tight ball, tucking his nose under his tail to conserve warmth. His body shook uncontrollably from the cold and the stress of the encounter. He closed his eyes, listening to the muffled sounds of the city overhead. The rumble of engines, the splashing of tires, the distant voices. He felt completely alone in the world, just a dirty, unwanted stray with no name and no home. He lay there, waiting for the rain to stop, waiting for a miracle, or perhaps just waiting for the end. He had no idea that in just a few moments, his life was about to change forever. He just lay there, invisible to the world, dreaming of a warm meal and a gentle hand. Time seemed to drag on endlessly under the car. The dog lay curled up in a tight ball, trying to preserve whatever little body heat he had left. The pavement was cold and hard, seeping into his bones, but at least he was out of the direct rain. From his low vantage point, he could see the lower legs and feet of people walking by on the sidewalk. Some moved quickly, the heavy thud of their boots vibrating through the ground. Others moved slowly, the click of heels echoing sharply. Every time a pair of feet stopped near the bumper, the dog would flinch, squeezing his eyes shut and waiting for a shout or a kick. But mostly, the world just walked on by, completely unaware of the life struggling just inches away from their shoes. The rain started to come down harder, drumming a rhythmic beat against the metal of the car above him. It was a lonely sound. The dog felt a deep heaviness in his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with hunger. It was the weight of being unwanted. He rested his chin on his paws, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was so tired. The cold was making him sleepy, a dangerous kind of sleepiness that he knew he shouldn't give in to, but it was getting harder to keep his eyes open. Then a new rhythm of footsteps approached. They didn't sound like the hurried, heavy stomp of a businessman, nor the sharp click of someone in a rush to get home. These steps were steady and calm. They slowed down as they got closer. The dog watched the feet through the gloom. They were a pair of simple, worn-out leather boots, laced up the front. They didn't look like expensive shoes, but they looked solid. The footsteps stopped right beside the car, just inches from the bumper. The dog held his breath. His muscles tensed up, ready to scramble deeper under the vehicle if he needed to. He expected the person to keep walking or maybe to lean against the car and wait for someone. But the person didn't move. Instead, the person crouched down. The dog watched as the boots moved out of his direct line of sight and were replaced by a pair of bent knees. A man was lowering himself to the ground. This was unusual. Most people looked down from a great height, looking right over him. This man was bringing himself to the dog's level. "Hey there," a voice said softly. The voice was deep and quiet, but there was no anger in it. There was no shooing motion. It was just a gentle greeting. The dog blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw a face peering under the bumper of the car. It was a man with a thick beard and kind eyes. He wasn't smiling in a mocking way, nor was he frowning with disgust. He was simply looking. The man didn't reach in suddenly. He kept his hands resting on his own knees, giving the dog space. He stayed there for a moment, just watching. It was as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was just focused on the scared, shivering animal hiding in the shadows. "You're okay," the man whispered. "I know it's wet out here." The dog's ears twitched. He smelled the air. The scent of the rain was strong, but there was another smell too. It was the smell of something warm, something savory. Coming from a bag the man had set down on the wet ground next to him. The man saw the dog's nose twitch. He saw the hesitation. He understood that fear is a powerful thing, often stronger than hunger. Very slowly, he reached into the bag. The dog recoiled slightly, pressing his back against the underside of the car. But the man didn't grab him. He pulled out a small, foil-wrapped packet. The crinkling sound was loud in the quiet space. The man unwrapped the packet carefully. The smell hit the dog instantly. It was a sandwich filled with meat and cheese. It smelled better than anything the dog had ever smelled in his life. It smelled like safety. It smelled like home. The man tore off a small piece of the meat. He didn't throw it. He didn't try to lure the dog out too far. He simply placed the piece of food on the pavement, right at the edge of the car's shadow, just within reach. Then he pulled his hand back. He sat back on his heels and waited. The dog's stomach screamed at him to move, but his brain warned him to stay still. He looked at the man, then at the food, then back at the man. The man didn't move. He just sat there in the rain, getting his pants wet, ignoring the people walking past them who were starting to stare. "It's for you," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "Go ahead." The hunger won. The dog slowly stretched his neck out. He sniffed the piece of meat fiercely. It didn't smell like a trap. It smelled like kindness. He snapped it up quickly, swallowing it whole before anyone could take it away. The taste exploded in his mouth. Salt, fat, flavor. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He looked at the man again, his eyes a little wider now. The man smiled very slightly. It was a sad sort of smile, one that showed he understood the dog's pain. He tore off another piece, a bigger one this time, and placed it a little further out on the pavement. The dog crept forward a few inches. His paws were cold on the wet ground, but he didn't care. He took the second piece, eating it a little slower this time. For the first time in a long time, the gnawing pain in his belly began to ease. The man didn't try to touch him yet. He knew that trust had to be earned. He just kept tearing off small pieces of the sandwich and placing them on the ground, creating a little trail that led the dog out from under the car. With each piece, the dog grew braver. He crawled out of the shadows and into the gray light of the rainy afternoon. He was a pitiful sight. His fur was soaked and muddy, his body was skeletal, and he was shivering violently. But as he finished the last crumb on the ground, he looked up at the man with something new in his eyes. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a question. The man looked at the dog's muddy fur and the way his ribs showed through his skin. He saw the fear that was still lingering in the animal's posture. He didn't see a stray. He didn't see a nuisance. He saw a living being that was suffering, and he decided in that moment that he wasn't going to leave it there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, but he kept his eyes on the dog the whole time. He wasn't calling animal control to come take the dog away to a noisy pound. He was making a different kind of call. As he spoke quietly into the phone, he held out one last large piece of the bread. Keeping it in his open palm, the dog looked at the hand. It was big, but it was steady. The man stayed perfectly still, offering the food, but also offering something much more valuable. He was offering a chance. The dog leaned forward and took the bread gently from the man's palm, his whiskers brushing against the skin. The man didn't pull away. He let the dog lick his fingers, cleaning off the last of the crumbs. It was a quiet moment in the middle of a busy city, a simple connection between a human and an animal. The rain was still falling, the cars were still driving by, but for those few seconds it felt like the world had stopped spinning. The dog was no longer invisible. He was seen, and he knew deep down that his life was about to change. The last crumb of bread had disappeared, but the dog still didn't move away. He sat there on the wet pavement, his tail giving a very small, hesitant wag. It was the first time he had wagged his tail in months. For a long moment, the man and the dog just looked at each other. The rain was still falling, dripping off the man's nose and chin, but he didn't wipe it away. He was too busy studying the animal in front of him. The man slowly reached out a hand again. This time, there was no food. The dog flinched, his ears flattening against his head, expecting a shove or a grab. But the hand didn't hit him. It landed gently on top of his head. The dog froze. He felt the fingers slide through his matted, dirty fur. It was a strange sensation, warmth transferring from the human to him. The man scratched lightly behind the dog's ears, finding a spot that the dog couldn't reach to scratch himself. It felt incredible. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing for a second, letting out a long, shaky breath. It was a moment of pure relief. As the man petted him, his expression changed. The gentle look in his eyes turned into a look of serious concern. He ran his hand down the dog's back, feeling the bumps of the spine. He could feel every rib. He looked at the dog's legs, noticing the way the left front paw was held up, swollen and sore. He saw the scratches on the dog's nose and the dullness of his coat. This wasn't just a hungry dog. This was a dog that had been fighting for his life and was losing. The man shifted his position and gently lifted the dog's chin to look at his neck. He was checking for a collar. There was none, of course. Just a ring of bare skin where a collar might have been once a long time ago. The man shook his head slightly, a silent frown on his face. He murmured something under his breath, too quiet for the dog to hear, but the tone was sad. He realized that this little soul belonged to no one. Or perhaps worse, that someone had once owned him and had let him go by now. The scene on the sidewalk had started to attract attention. The city was never truly empty, and a man crouching in the rain, petting a stray dog, was bound to draw eyes. At first, it was just one or two people walking by, glancing over with mild curiosity. But then someone stopped. A young woman pulling a suitcase paused and looked closely at the man's face. Her eyes went wide. She nudged the person next to her and whispered. Within seconds, a small crowd began to form. People were pulling out their phones, holding them up to capture the moment. The camera shutters clicked and the soft buzz of recording devices filled the air. The whispers grew louder. "Is that?" someone asked. "It looks like him." "Oh my God, it really is him," another voice whispered. It was a famous actor, a movie star known all over the world, usually seen on giant screens in action movies or on red carpets. But here he was, on his knees in a dirty street, wearing a damp jacket and a simple pair of boots. He looked nothing like a celebrity in that moment. He looked like a man who cared deeply about a living creature that was hurting, but the strangest thing was that he didn't care about the cameras. He didn't look up at the phones. He didn't wave or smile for the pictures. He didn't try to hide his face or rush away. He acted as if the crowd didn't exist. His entire world had shrunk down to the space of a few feet, just him and the dog. He was oblivious to the fame that usually followed him. In his mind there was no movie star and stray dog. There were just two living beings, one helping the other. The dog, however, was getting nervous. He sensed the energy of the crowd change. He felt the eyes of many people staring at him. He started to tremble again, pressing closer to the man's legs, seeking protection. He didn't understand why these people were watching, and he was scared they might take away his new friend. The man seemed to sense the dog's fear immediately. He moved his body slightly, positioning himself between the dog and the gathering crowd. It was a protective gesture, a silent signal to back off and give them space. He continued to stroke the dog's back, speaking in a low, soothing rumble that vibrated in his chest. "I've got you," he said quietly. Loud enough for the dog to hear, but low enough that the microphones on the phones couldn't pick it up clearly. "It's okay?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a phone. He kept one hand on the dog the entire time, maintaining that physical connection that kept the dog calm. He tapped the screen and held the phone to his ear. The crowd went silent, everyone trying to listen to who he might be calling. Was it his agent? A manager? A bodyguard? "Hi," the man said into the phone. His voice was calm and urgent. "I need a ride." "Right now?" He paused, listening. "Yeah, I'm on 5th, near the market." He looked down at the dog's injured paw. "And I need you to call the vet. Tell Dr. Miller I'm bringing in a patient. A severe case. Malnourished trauma to the leg. Yeah, I'll pay for everything. Just have them ready." The people in the crowd looked at each other in surprise. He wasn't calling a studio or a friend to pick him up for a party. He was arranging medical care for a stray dog he had just met. And he was already talking about paying for it. A few minutes later, A large black car pulled up to the curb, maneuvering through the light traffic. The driver jumped out quickly and opened the rear door. The man stood up slowly. His knees were stiff from crouching on the hard pavement. He looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at him, confusion in his eyes. He thought the man was leaving. He thought the food and the warmth were over. He let out a small whimper, his ears drooping. The man didn't walk away. He leaned down and, without any hesitation at all, slid both arms under the dog's body. He lifted the dog up into his arms. The dog was lighter than he should have been, a bundle of bones and matted fur. The dog didn't struggle. He didn't snap or growl. He seemed to understand that he was being lifted, not to be thrown, but to be helped. He went limp, surrendering completely to the man. The man didn't mind the dirt. He didn't mind that the wet, muddy fur was soaking into his expensive jacket. He didn't care that the smell of the street was now clinging to him. He pulled the dog close to his chest, wrapping one arm around the dog's back to support the injured leg and tucking the dog's head under his chin. It was a tight, secure embrace. He turned toward the car. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, no longer taking pictures but just watching in silence. There was a collective feeling of witnessing something rare and genuine. The man carried the dog to the open car door. He didn't just toss the dog in. He climbed into the back seat himself, still holding the dog securely on his lap. He gently positioned the animal so he wouldn't jostle his sore leg. As the car door clicked shut, shutting out the noise of the rain and the whispers of the crowd, the dog let out a long sigh. He was warm. He was safe. He was off the cold ground. He rested his head on the man's knee, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what would happen next. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew he was with the right person. As the car pulled away into the traffic, leaving the curious onlookers behind, the journey to a new life had truly begun. The ride in the car was smooth and quiet, a stark contrast to the bumpy, scary sidewalks the dog was used to. He spent the entire trip curled up on the man's lap, his head resting heavily on the man's leg. He could feel the rumble of the engine beneath him, but for the first time he wasn't shivering from the cold. The man's hand stayed on his back, a steady, comforting weight that made the dog feel secure. When the car finally stopped, the dog lifted his head anxiously, worried that he was being dropped off at another strange street corner, but they weren't on a street corner. They were parked in front of a clean, modern building with a sign that read, "Animal Hospital." The man got out first and then reached in to lift the dog out, holding him just as gently as before. As they walked through the glass doors, the air smelled different. It didn't smell like exhaust fumes or garbage. It smelled like soap and disinfectant. It was the smell of a place where things get fixed. Inside, the staff was busy. But as soon as they saw who had walked in, the room went quiet. The receptionist's eyes widened, and a veterinarian in a white coat hurried out from the back room. But the man didn't stop for autographs or pleasantries. He walked straight to the exam table and carefully set the dog down. He kept one hand on the dog's shoulder the entire time, whispering to him, telling him he was safe. The next few hours were a blur of new sensations for the dog. He was poked and prodded, but he didn't growl or snap because he sensed that these people were there to help him. The veterinarian was kind and thorough. She cleaned the deep scratches on his face and examined his swollen leg. It turned out not to be broken, just badly bruised and sprained, likely from being kicked or stepped on. They gave him medicine for the pain and something to help him sleep. The hardest part was the bath. They led him to a large tub filled with warm, soapy water. At first, the dog panicked. He hated water. It meant cold rain and misery. But as the warm water soaked into his fur, he realized this was different. Two gentle assistants scrubbed away months of dirt, grease, and mud. The water turned a dark brown as the grime washed away. When they finally rinsed him off and dried him with a fluffy towel, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. His fur was actually a golden brown color, soft and light. He felt 10 pounds lighter over the next few weeks. A transformation took place that was truly unbelievable to anyone who had seen him on the street. This wasn't just a bath. It was a total recovery. The dog stayed at the clinic under the man's care, eating high-quality food and taking medicine to help his body heal. The hunger that had been his constant companion for so long slowly vanished, replaced by a healthy, full feeling. His ribs began to disappear under a layer of muscle and fat. His fur grew out thick and shiny, no longer matted with painful tangles. The cut on his nose healed, leaving only a tiny pink scar. Even his eyes changed. The dull, defeated look was replaced by a bright, alert sparkle. He started to stand taller. He started to wag his tail a real, full-body wag that knocked things off tables. But the most unbelievable part of the story wasn't just the physical change. It was what happened when the dog was finally healthy enough to leave the clinic. Usually, when a famous person helps an animal, they pay the bills and maybe find a nice adoptive family for it. It's a good thing to do, but there is often a distance kept. The staff at the clinic assumed this would happen too. They prepared the paperwork for a standard adoption, thinking the actor would find the dog a good home with a fenced yard and maybe some kids to play with. On the day the dog was discharged, the veterinarian brought out the leash. She smiled at the actor and said, "So, we have a few families on our waiting list who are very excited to meet him. He's such a good dog now, he will get adopted in seconds." The man looked at the veterinarian, then he looked down at the dog. The dog was sitting by his feet, looking up with those big, hopeful eyes. The dog didn't know about waiting lists or families. He just knew that this man was the one who had saved him. This man was the one who smelled safe. The man shook his head slowly. "There's no waiting list," he said softly. The vet looked confused. "I don't understand," she said. "Aren't you finding him a home?" The man reached down and hooked the leash onto the dog's collar, but he didn't hand the leash to anyone else. He held it in his own hand. He looked at the dog and scratched him behind the ears, a gesture they had both come to love. "He already has a home," the man said simply. "He's coming with me." The room went silent. The vet and the nurses just stared for a moment. It wasn't a publicity stunt. He wasn't doing it for the cameras that were surely waiting outside. He genuinely loved this dog. He had formed a bond with the scared, dirty creature under that car, and he wasn't about to break it. He didn't want a purebred puppy from a fancy breeder. He wanted the survivor. He wanted the dog that nobody else wanted. He signed the papers, listed himself as the owner, and walked out the front door with the dog trotting happily beside him. The dog's limp was barely noticeable now. His head was held high, his golden ears flopping in the wind. He wasn't a stray anymore. He had a name, a collar, and a bed waiting for him in the weeks that followed. The city got to witness this new friendship. Paparazzi and fans would spot them walking in the park or sitting outside a coffee shop. The photos that popped up on the internet were amazing. In one picture, the famous actor is talking on the phone and the dog is lying across his feet, fast asleep. In another, they are playing fetch, the man laughing as the dog runs joyfully through the grass. It was clear that the dog wasn't just a pet. He was a companion. The actor treated him with total respect and love. And the dog, in return, gave his absolute loyalty. He had gone from being invisible and unwanted to being the most important thing in his owner's life. It was a rags-to-riches story that no screenwriter could have invented, a perfect ending that was really just a new beginning. The dog who almost died in the rain was now living the best life a dog could possibly imagine. One whole year had passed since the rainy afternoon that changed everything, and life for the dog was now completely unrecognizable. He woke up not on cold, hard concrete or under a dirty car, but on the softest, thickest bed he could have ever imagined. It was an orthopedic foam bed designed for large dogs, placed right in the sunny spot of a warm, quiet living room. The sun streamed through the window, hitting his golden brown fur and making it shine like polished copper. He stretched his front legs out long, his toes curling in pleasure, before letting out a massive, satisfied yawn. There was no hunger pain twisting in his stomach. There was no fear of footsteps or shouting voices. There was just peace. In the kitchen, the familiar sounds of morning began. The clinking of a spoon against a ceramic mug, the hum of the coffee machine, and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. The dog's ears perked up. He knew these sounds well. He stood up, gave his body a vigorous shake to wake himself up, and trotted into the kitchen on all four paws. His limp was gone now, healed completely by the medicine and the care he had received. He moved with a confident, happy gait, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. The man was standing by the counter, dressed in simple clothes, looking out the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. He turned when he heard the dog enter and smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good morning, buddy," the man said, his voice raspy and kind. "Sleep well?" The dog wagged his tail, thumping it happily against the kitchen island. He sat down and looked up expectantly. He didn't have to beg anymore. He didn't have to limp through the streets looking for scraps. He simply had to show up, and he was loved. The man put down his coffee and prepared the dog's breakfast, a mix of high-quality dry food and a little bit of wet food, the kind that smelled like real meat. As the dog ate, the man leaned against the counter and watched him, sipping his coffee. It was a quiet, domestic moment, far removed from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. But it was the man's favorite part of the day. After breakfast, it was time for their daily routine. They didn't just stay inside. They explored the world together. But now, when they walked out the front door, the dog was on a sturdy leather leash, walking right beside his human. They walked through the busy city streets, but the dynamic was entirely different. The dog was no longer an invisible ghost. He held his head high, his tail wagging gently, greeting the world with curiosity instead of fear. People still stopped and stared. They recognized the man, of course. He was one of the most famous actors on the planet. But more and more people were starting to recognize the dog, too. They would smile and point, whispering, "Look, it's the dog from the video." He looks so happy now. The man never rushed away. If someone asked to pet the dog, he would pause and let them. He watched proudly as his dog soaked up the attention, accepting gentle pats and ear scratches from strangers. The dog had transformed from a terrified stray into a confident, loving ambassador for rescue animals everywhere. One afternoon, they found themselves on a film set. The man was back at work, filming a new action movie. It was a chaotic environment filled with loud explosions, bright lights, and hundreds of crew members rushing around. For any normal dog, it might have been overwhelming. But this dog had seen the worst of humanity on the streets. A few loud bangs didn't scare him as long as his person was nearby. The man had insisted that the dog come to the set every day. Between scenes, while the crew was resetting the cameras or adjusting the lights, the man would retreat to his trailer or sit in a director's chair with the dog lying at his feet. In those quiet moments, the dog provided a sense of calm that the man desperately needed. The acting world is full of fake emotions and pretend scenarios, but the love between the man and the dog was 100% real. When the man petted the dog's head, he wasn't acting. He was grounding himself. During a break in filming, a journalist from a popular entertainment magazine managed to get a few minutes with the man. They sat on the edge of the set, the dog lying on the man's feet, fast asleep. The journalist asked the question that everyone was thinking. "It's an incredible story," the journalist said. "You found this dog in the gutter, sick and alone, and now look at him. You saved his life. That's an amazing thing you did." The man looked down at the sleeping dog. He reached down and stroked the soft fur on the dog's back. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "I think people have it backwards," the man said softly. "They say I saved him, but I don't look at it that way. The truth is, I was having a hard time. Life was heavy. I was lonely in a way that's hard to explain when you're surrounded by people all the time." He paused, scratching the dog behind the ear. The dog sighed in his sleep and pressed closer to the man's leg. "That day, when I saw him shivering under that car, he needed help. But when I sat down with him and he trusted me enough to take the food from my hand, something inside me healed. He gave me a purpose that day. He reminded me that it doesn't matter who you are or how much money you have. What matters is kindness. He saved me just as much as I saved him. Probably more." The journalist was silent, moved by the honesty in the actor's voice. It wasn't a polished PR statement. It was a human being talking about his best friend. Later that week, the man decided to take a detour on their walk home. He steered the dog toward the busy downtown area, the same neighborhood where they had first met. The air smelled of car exhaust and street food, just like it had that day. As they walked, the man slowed down. He was looking for something. Finally, he stopped on a familiar corner. There was the black lamp post. There was the crack in the sidewalk. And there was the spot where the food cart used to park. The man looked down at the empty space, then down at his dog. The dog sniffed the air. His tail gave a little wag, and he looked up at the man with bright eyes. He didn't seem to remember the fear of this place. He only remembered it as the place where his life began. The man crouched down on the sidewalk, right there where he had first offered the sandwich. He put his hands on the dog's face and looked him in the eyes. "Remember this place?" he whispered. "This is where we found each other." A young couple walked by, pushing a stroller. They recognized the actor immediately and stopped to watch. It was a surreal scene, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, kneeling on a dirty city sidewalk, hugging a dog that used to be a stray. But nobody interrupted. They just watched, knowing they were witnessing a moment of pure gratitude. The man stood up, and they continued their walk. But this time, the dog walked with a little extra spring in his step. He seemed to understand that they had closed a circle. They had returned to the place of darkness and found it filled with light. The months turned into a year, and the bond between them only grew stronger. They became inseparable. If the man went to a bookstore, the dog waited patiently outside, watching the door. If they went to the park for a game of fetch, the man would throw the ball over and over again, long after his arm was tired, just to see the dog run with joy. The dog had a collar now, made of soft leather, with a silver tag that had his name and the man's phone number engraved on it. He was microchipped and registered. He had health insurance and a stockpile of toys. But none of those things were what made him happy. What made him happy was the sound of the man's key in the lock at the end of the day. It was the simple fact that he was no longer alone. On a cool evening, about a year after the rescue, the man and the dog were sitting on a hill overlooking the city lights. The city was vast and loud, a million stories happening all at once. But up on the hill, it was quiet. The man sat on the grass, leaning back on his hands, staring out at the view. The dog was sitting right next to him, pressed against his side, his head resting on the man's shoulder. The dog looked up at the man, his eyes reflecting the city lights. He let out a small, contented sigh and closed his eyes. He didn't know about movies or fame. He didn't know that people were writing articles about his story. He only knew that he was warm. He was full. And he was loved. The man wrapped his arm around the dog's shoulders, pulling him in closer. He scratched that special spot behind the ear, and the dog leaned into the touch. It was a simple embrace between two souls who had been lost in the crowd, but had managed to find each other. "You're a good boy," the man whispered into the dog's fur. The best boy. It was unbelievable, really. The odds of them meeting were astronomical. In a city of millions, a starving stray and a lonely superstar had crossed paths at the exact right moment. It was a story that seemed too perfect to be true. Yet, as they sat there together under the stars, it was the most real thing in the world. The dog drifted off to sleep, dreaming of chasing squirrels in wide-open fields, safe in the knowledge that when he woke up, his best friend would still be there. The nightmare of the streets was over. The cold, the hunger, and the fear were just distant memories. He had traveled from the gutter to the stars, but he didn't care about the destination. He only cared about who was sitting beside him. And that, as the man would say, was the only happy ending that truly mattered.